Welcome to the audience, and over to Dennis to welcome our speaker. Thank you. Right, good evening. Briefly, before I introduce Max, we have Benjamin. As most of you know, Fiona Startup is proposing to make a bronze statuette of Benjamin as a memorial to our late lamented life member. There is a petition to the local board to be signed at Bookmark across the road, and we need money for this admirable venture. There is a collecting box out the table back there, or better still, you can go across to Bookmark and make a nice large donation. Now, introducing Max. Max has said that he would like my introduction short. But I'm sorry, Max. A, I like the sound of my own voice, and B, I have some points to make, particularly about the time and place of our first acquaintance.
You might want to sit down, actually.
Max went to Albert Grammar, which makes him the second distinguished writer after Carl Stead from that school, who has been kind enough to talk to us this year. More significantly, he was a student at Auckland University College in the 1950s and completed an honours degree in English literature and etymology from the now mythical University of New Zealand. There is now a large sign by the side of the road in the bush north of Whangarei which says University of New Zealand. I have never found out why, but I suppose that's where old defunct universities go. Auckland University College in the 50s was a modest tertiary institution and had the outstanding merit of being unpretentious, unlike the present university. I am in the process of handing over some old capping books from the 50s to the university archives. Mildly obscene publications which went with the capping procession and the capping review. And if my memory serves me right, Max was heavily involved with the reviews, which were frequently very funny, being written by some very talented people. Alas, all that is now a thing of the past, and to my mind the university today is dull and far, far too serious. It's supposed to be fun. You have, thank God, finished with school and its restrictions, and now you can enjoy life. The college was a smallish place, and Max stood out even then. What is definitely needed now, before it is too late, and we are all dust, is a memoir of a totally vanished time and place by someone who can actually write English, like Max. Max is a Renaissance man. He excels in so many fields. It would be tedious to list them all, but amongst other things, he plays the piano, he sings, he acts, and he speaks and writes with wit and erudition. He's the Dr. Samuel Johnson of today, and I wonder who will be Boswell.
Upstaged is right. Well, for the business of the evening, I point out that all of us here in this room take the power of language for granted. We've done so all our lives. We even accept that language has transitions. Shakespeare nowadays often has to be explained, and Jane Austen, I think, would be turned down as a job as a TV news reporter. We absorb changes in structure and vocabulary without protest. We all get used to disappearance of words like wireless or toll call, gone. We understand new words like internet and online, tweeting, social media, and blog. We don't ring up anymore, we call. Our hotels have changed all their ground floors into floor number 1, first floor, because Americans complained that in the lift, the letter G meant garage, and they didn't like it. Air New Zealand announces that during takeoff and landing would passengers please not use the 1 metre square toilet, laughingly referred to as a bathroom. And quite recently, officials from all sources have completely eliminated the very common word problem. It is rare nowadays that you will hear the word problem. It is called an issue. The new Waterview tunnel couldn't open on the scheduled date because the sprinklers weren't working and traffic couldn't possibly use the tunnel in safety. But the manager's official statement was, there is an issue with the sprinklers.
Not a problem.
Not a problem. They weren't working. Now, the airline's technology systems here in New Zealand detected a possible fault in the operating system of a New Zealand passenger plane already in flight. But they announced they were able to negotiate and correct this issue before the plane crashed into the Cook Strait. Conflicts about housing, immigration beset the City Council, but they're never referred to. They are not problems, they're issues. And with the exception of cars, it's now very rare that anything else has a breakdown because it's called an outage. For no known reason, a violent storm during the recent times in the North Island was called a weather event. So one report said, and I quote, "The weather event in the Bay of Plenty has brought an outcome of prolonged power outages and accommodation issues." Now, all of this we take in our stride, but try to imagine a time when all of us in this room could neither speak, write, or think in what we now take for granted, a language giving the ability to communicate. Whatever general usage and fashionable euphemisms we take for granted, few of us ever stop to reflect how civilization could have been before there was a language. But when language did evolve, it gradually branched into the 6,000 separate languages that now exist. Emeritus Professor Corballis is an international authority on psychology and language, and he examines the distant days when there was no actual language as we know it at all. Rudimentary communication was somehow achieved, but without being written or spoken. Eventually, there grew the urge to communicate more effectively, and that relevant time frame could go back as far as 2,000 years. From then, he examines the long passage towards the physical, mental, and graphic communication possessors that we now have. Many believe, he discovered, that this extraordinary commodity known as language came as a Big Bang sudden occurrence, perhaps a gift out of the blue from a benign deity, also known as God, which sprang fully formed overnight by an ancient miracle as described in Genesis chapter 11. If so, did that deity deliver the Hebrew language to those to whom he was speaking, plus the English language to all the people in this room, as well as Japanese, the Quran, and the 300 languages spoken across Australia? Or alternatively, did language evolve? What other influences were in process to result in the 6,000 languages which can be identified in our world today? Michael Corballis is aware that language is not just conversation. It includes gesture and behavior, plus the enigma of whether we can think internally without actual language. He also reminds us of a statement by the late, great actress Mae West, who once said, "I speak 2 languages, English and body." We are reminded that without language we would also be without not only Mae West, but James Bond, Harry Potter, Hamlet, Charlotte Bronte, Jack Reacher, and Mills and Boon. One particular factor in this examination is whether there is any relationship between the way we think and talk and the animal kingdom. Professor Corballis is aware that creatures without actual speech can communicate quite a lot, but they lack the building blocks which we have, the nouns, the verbs, and the indefinite article. These are the devices which distinguish language from just communication. Among us, there is language differs from the well-established fact that there is a kind of communication between us and some animals. For instance, a dog can be taught to identify objects and commands up to 100 items, but he cannot tell another dog, and we can. He reports there is a fascinating symmetry sometimes between what we say and how we look. An example being when we say you, the lips go out. When we say me, it's all taken back inside. Language is part of the glue that binds us together. Isaac Newton is quoted as saying, "If I have seen anything further, it is by standing on the shoulder of giants." To learn more about the origin of languages, we, figuratively, stand on the shoulders of Professor Michael Corballis.
Well, any questions?
One comment that Max is quite wrong about problem, because whenever you go to a restaurant and ask the waiter to do something, the immediate answer is not a problem.
Yeah, true. Well, I have two confessions to make. One is that I also am a graduate of the University of New Zealand, actually the Victoria University of College as it then was. And second, that I was the editor of the Capping magazine. 2 years in a row, I think. Okay, now Matt has identified the problem. The problem is why we have this thing called language and other species don't. And I want to take you back first to Darwin, who published in 1859 Origin of Species, and that of course led to an uproar about whether we in fact evolved from apes. And the professor of philology at the University of Oxford, Max Müller, wrote the following: "Where then is the difference between brute and man? What is it that man can do, and of which we find no signs, no rudiments in the whole brute world? I answer without hesitation, the one great barrier between the brute and man is language. Man speaks, and no brute has ever uttered a word." Actually, he neglects the parrot, I should say. "Language is our Rubicon, and no brute will dare cross it." I originally wanted to call this book actually Crossing the Rubicon, but the publishers didn't like that, so I had to have a much more daring title, which is The Truth About Language. Nobody knows the truth about language. So what is it about language that makes it special? Because, of course, other creatures are noisy, monkeys chatter, birds sing, and the rest of it. The difference is that language is almost infinitely variable. There's no limit to what we can say and what we might say. And as far as we know, no other animal communicates like that. You might think that birds do, because their bird songs can be quite intricate, but in fact they're enormously repetitive. And as far as we know, they're not telling stories. They're not gossiping. They're making mating calls, territory calls, and that sort of thing. So it does seem that human language kind of stands out. If you want a definition of language, I think the best one that I know, probably, it's quite a long definition, probably comes from Stephen Fry and the old television program, A Bit of Fry and Laurie. "Language is my whore, my mistress, my wife, my pen friend, my checkout girl. Language is a complimentary, moist, lemon-scented cleansing square or handy freshen-up wipette. Language is the breath of God, the dew on a fresh apple. It's the soft rain of dust that falls in a shaft of morning sun when you pull from an old bookshelf a forgotten volume of erotic diaries. Language is the faint scent of urine on a pair of boxer shorts. It's a half-remembered childhood birthday party, a creak on the stair, a spluttering match held to a frosted pane, the warm, wet, trusting touch of a leaking nappy. The hulk of a charred panzer, the underside of a granite boulder, the first downy growth on the upper lip of a Mediterranean girl, cobwebs long since overrun by an old Wellington boot." Is that a good definition of language? And if it's what he's saying is that language is infinitely variable. I mean, just to produce that set of words is an extraordinary feat in itself. And you could go to any library like this one, pick out a book at random, open it at random, pick out a sentence you've never seen or heard before, and you'll understand it, I hope. With luck, you even understand the sentence that I'm speaking now, although I believe it is a sentence that you have never before in your lives heard. And you all have the look of comprehension on your faces. That's the problem. Now, how do you solve the problem? It's a really hard problem to solve, because there are something like 6,000 languages in the world, and they're all different. They're all, for the most part, any pair chosen at random is incomprehensible to the other, each being a completely different language, even with different rules. Noam Chomsky has tried very hard to establish what might be the common rule, what he likes to call universal grammar. But he's never really convinced anybody that he's found it. I think the one sort of principle that he articulates has come to be called unbounded merge. So language consists of the merging of elements and the merging of the merged elements and the merging of merged elements. So what we do with language is we take sounds, we put them together to form syllables, we put those together to form words, we put those together to form phrases, we put those together to form sentences, we put sentences together to tell stories. So that's what he calls unbounded merge. And his principles of grammar have, over the years, come down to that. But that, I think, is actually not very unusual in terms of what animals can do. Most of our actions, for example, can break down into small actions that become larger actions that then become visits to the supermarket. So the idea of elements being merged into larger units is in fact not terribly profound. Neither is it, in my opinion, restricted to language. So how do we explain the fact that there are 6,000 of these things, all rather different, and that any child can be assumed to be able to learn any one of them? So no matter where a child was born, moving to a different culture, a different race, a different city, children can instantly pick up the new language. So that's, only children can do it, of course. I mean, we can learn a second language very badly, but it becomes increasingly hard to do it after the age of puberty, approximately, which is precisely, by the way, when we choose to teach language to our kids. Precisely when they go to secondary school, when it's too late. So second languages can be learned with some effort, usually with an accent that won't go away, but that's because they're really built on the first language. As far as we know, once a child passes the age of about 12 or 13, not having experienced any language, it becomes impossible to learn. There are only very few cases of that, but where they have come up, that seems to be what happens. So that's the problem, and how do we solve it? Now, I'm not going to tell you how we solve it in any detail, because if I do, you won't buy the book. But I do want to make a number of comments about it. Noam Chomsky and his friends, and including a number of archaeologists, claim that this happened in a single step within the last 100,000 years. Our species, Homo sapiens, is only in the last couple of 200,000 years. So that's a very limited time period upon which this miraculous event could have happened. We actually have something like 6 million years to play with, because the common ancestor of your good selves and the chimpanzee goes back about 6 million years. You probably don't remember that period of time, but at that time we were indistinguishable from a chimpanzee. Since that time, both humans and chimpanzees have, of course, evolved. So it becomes a little bit ridiculous, I think, to suppose that language evolved within the last mere 50 or 70,000 years. If you think of that 6 million years as a 24-hour day, then language occurred in the last 20 minutes. And I like to think that we actually have about 6 million years to play with in order to try to understand what it was that led to the emergence of language, as we like to know it. I think it probably emerged through pantomime. My idea is that language probably evolved first as a manual thing. See, I'm waving my arms about already, though I try not to. But I think if you observe any people having a conversation, even giving a lecture, and even I think Max was doing it, they use their hands as much as they use their voices. So language probably started as a kind of pantomime, I think, and it was probably aided by the fact that we became fully bipedal about 3 million years ago. So that probably freed up the hands for a form of communication that is not possible for a cow. Right? It's somewhat possible, I think, for other primates, monkeys, chimpanzees and the like, but I think it's not until we became fully bipedal that as a mode of complex expression became possible. And of course it's an obvious way to communicate if you can't speak. And it's pretty clear that other primates and other animals don't have the flexibility of vocal control that they could use the voice. So that had to come quite late, I think. The ability to use one's voice to produce patterns, voluntary patterns of sounds, like I'm trying to do now, that makes sense. So nobody's ever taught a dog or an ape to speak, but apes are quite good, insofar as they've been tried, at gesturing their intent. There's a famous chimpanzee, actually a bonobo, not a chimpanzee, called Kanzi, who's been taught to understand moderately complex instructions by gesture and by pointing to symbols on a keyboard. So the entire thing becomes like a kind of a tablet or whatever, an iPad. So they point away and they can make comments and they can follow instructions. So they can't speak, but they can do a moderately reasonable job of gesturing. Now, once our forebears, like 2.5 to 3 million years ago, became bipedal, the hands were then freed up for expression. And the hands are quite good at mimicking things. I mean, you can have running, walking, cow jumping over the moon, and the like. So I think that's a natural way for communication to begin. And it's also what we do when we're stuck in a foreign country and can't speak the language, right? I once had a great deal of difficulty trying to get a bottle opener in Russia. And I didn't know the word for bottle opener, but like that for a while. They were first actually quite alarmed, and I think they were going to call the police, but eventually they discovered what I wanted and collapsed in laughter and went and found me a bottle opener. So I think we all do this when we're faced with the problem of communicating without having words to do that with. So that's the kind of theory I have, and the idea is, this is only part of what I wanted to say about the evolution over time, but that takes us back not just a mere 50,000 years, but more like 3 million. So that gives us time to suppose that this ability to communicate with the hands evolved. Now, obviously, we don't still communicate with our hands in that fashion. We do to some extent, and we do in foreign countries, but of course there's one case in which it is very effective and very language-like, and that's sign language. And we now know that the sign languages that are invented by deaf communities have all of the properties of true language. They have nouns and verbs and sentences and meaning and all the rest of it. In fact, deaf people are inclined to think that sign language is superior to spoken language because it's got that nice pictorial and often emotional aspect to it. And some deaf communities will not allow their hearing children to learn to speak. There's a culture called deaf with a capital D, and they want their children to be in that culture because they think of it as superior. Now, in the course of time, one can imagine that communication systems conventionalize. That is, you no longer have to draw the complete picture with your hands of what you're trying to say, actress and the bishop or whatever, but you can conventionalize it so you can have simplified signs that will carry the meaning. Through convention, through the understanding of the community that you're in. And I think that probably eventually also simplified to the point that you didn't have to use your hands at all. We still do, but you don't have to. And I think probably the sequence of events was something like language retreated into the face. So the face is very expressive. So we can make lots of different facial movements that will convey meanings. And if you watch people doing sign language, an awful lot of it is actually conveyed by the expressions in the face. It's quite interesting to watch. And of course, the mouth is part of the face. So the kind of idea that I have is that language did sort of become partly manual, partly facial, and eventually retreated into the mouth. So what I am doing now is I'm gesturing. I'm gesturing with my mouth. So within my mouth I have a tongue, I have a larynx, I have lips, and I'm gesturing with these things to create a lot of different patterns of sound, which through convention you understand to mean words. or sentences. And that is the first example, to my mind, of miniaturization. So what speech is miniaturized gesture. It's beautiful because it's all tucked inside the mouth, where it requires very little sort of effort, very little energy to produce sequences of sounds. So I think that over the course of that 3-odd million years, it became adaptive to do that, because it's a form of gesture that's very effective. It's of course gestures that you can't see very well, so these gestures are happening inside the mouth. So what's the solution to that? The solution to that is to run sound through it. So the sound is altered by the gestures that you're making in your mouth. And that is what we call speech. And I think in some ways the whole history of human evolution and advancement can be tied to changes in the way we communicate, right? So from crude gestures which try to show things pictorially, through to this highly elegant and conventionalized system for making noises in the mouth, through to writing. That was another advance, which then puts it back on in the visual domain. And it has advantages because writing can be written down or carved in stone or whatever, and then it becomes a semi-permanent record. Whereas speech, of course, fades. My voice, my messages that I'm giving you will be lost, I think, within about 5 minutes. So speech itself is not terribly effective if you want your message, your stories to last. So writing was the next step. And then, of course, we go to computer kinds of things. That's even more effective because we can go long distances. You can text your friend in Canada or whatever, so texting. So the whole business of communication has become miniaturized and varied and made more efficient all the time. And if you watch kids on their cell phones now, you'll see it's gone back to gesture. They're gesturing with their thumbs, are they not? As they hold the little thing, you see the thumb moving back and forth very fast over a tiny, tiny keyboard. So that's part of my story. Another part of my story has to do with what Chomsky and so forth like to call generativity, what I mentioned right at the beginning. That we can, there's no limit to what we can say, right? The example of the library illustrates that. This is yet another sentence I'm uttering to you now, which you have never heard before, but which is a moderately intelligent sentence that I'm sure you will understand, even though it's entirely novel to you. So the idea that we can produce this kind of variability is one of the properties that becomes hard to explain. Now, I think that this is not a property of language. I think it's a property of imagination. So it happens that we have very rich imaginations. We can remember all sorts of things that happened in our past. We can dream. We can imagine future events. We can imagine stories, and we tell those stories. But the imagination itself is not language. I think the imagination itself is something that brains do. And I even think that probably the chimpanzee has a much more of an imagination than you might know. Even your cat or your dog, as it slumbers by the fire, may be dreaming or imagining things, but it can't tell you. So what we have in human evolution is the ability to tell these things, to share them. And I think that's really very important in the way that human society worked. I think it's probably got a lot to do with the fact that the early humans had a tough life on the African savannah. They ran out of food and resources, and they kept having to move. And of course, humans have moved over the entire globe and even beyond it. So I think the emergence of the need to communicate and share is part of the problems that we, through human history, have been a migratory species. Not migration in the sense that like birds go to one place always, but we are always seeking new territories. Perhaps less obvious now, but even now, of course, there are people migrating to New Zealand. New Zealanders migrating all over the place. And communication is part of that sort of lifestyle that has become perhaps the defining characteristic, I think, of what humans are about. I think I should stop about there, because what I would like to do is to see if you've understood what I've been saying and have any questions you might like me to address.
Does your idea extend to explaining the symbols used in writing? some forms of writing are pictorial.
Yes, I mean,
some are alphabetical.
Yes, I mean, some forms of writing are much more pictorial than others, like Asian scripts, and you would know about that. And they probably all emerged from sort of symbols that were resembling something, but they have become conventionalized too. So we no longer see the pictorial aspect, or what's called the iconic aspect. So the history of communication, I think, is the history of conventionalization, so you take away the pictorial or the sound aspect. Max mentioned also that some of the ways we speak also have a pictorial aspect, like you and me, and I go into a number of examples of that. So gradually it becomes more carried by society itself than carried by the shape of the symbol.
I have a question. I have a question.
I know you do.
It's because in your book and in your talk tonight, complex though this subject is, there's only one word which I didn't understand. So rather than look it up, I thought I'll wait till the night and ask you, what is a bonobo?
A bonobo is...
Does anyone know? Am I alone, or does everybody know?
It's an ape, and I think the bonobo and the chimpanzee share equal common ancestry with ourselves. So at some point there was a common ancestor that was either a bonobo or a chimp, as I understand it, and they split off, I don't know, a couple of million years ago, I don't know the exact time. So the bonobo and the chip are equally distant from us in terms of evolution.
There's another point I'd like you to comment on. We now know much more than we knew before about speaking, thinking, communicating. What about the difference that, or the ability we have to think into the future?
Right. Now, until quite recently, a colleague of mine declared that not only do we think into the past and recover the past and imagine the past, but we think into the future. We can imagine future events, and we can also imagine imaginary events when we tell stories that are not true, or simply in fiction. So we dubbed this mental time travel, the ability to travel mentally in time. And I think we do this all the time. And I think the purpose of language, by the way, is to be able to talk about things that are not in the present. That includes going into the future and talking about that, things in the past, talking about that, or even talking about, say, being in Paris. I think you could probably, or if you've been to Paris, I invite you to go there right now. All right? So we have this extraordinary ability to travel around in time and space. I thought until recently that this was something that only humans did, and that's why only humans have language. But I've still since then been convinced by neurophysiological research, actually on rats, that show that they have an extraordinary ability to repeat past events and imagine future ones. And how do we know that? We know that because there's a structure in the brain called the hippocampus, which I think is Greek for seahorse, and recordings of that correspond to where an animal is located in space. So they put an electrode into the hippocampus of the rat. I hope you're following me here. And if the rat's in a particular location, a particular cell in the hippocampus fires. The animal moves, then another cell fires, right? So it's a GPS system in the rat brain, and it's also in the human brain, and no doubt in the primate brain. It's also been discovered, moderately recently, that the rat will sometimes, when it's not in the maze, it will replay a past event in the maze. And you can tell that by tracking in the hippocampus which cells fire, which cells are active, right? And sometimes the sequence of cells that fire correspond to something that the rat did not do, but is assumed to be what it's going to do in the future. So this business of mental time travel is probably not uniquely human at all. It's a little bit more primitive than the rat, but it has quite sophisticated properties. And I think what we have done as humans, we've invented a way of communicating these travels. It's not that those travels are unique to us. Even in the rat, it's extraordinarily sophisticated because it is recursive. So you can imagine yourself right here in this room, and locate yourself in this room, and there's a little hippocampal cell that's telling you that, right? But it can also tell you where you are located in the city of Auckland, or in this library, or in the world. So it has this remarkable capacity to understand location, not only in time, but at different levels of magnification, if you like, or different spatial scales. So these things go way back in evolution, and I think that's given the imagination a long time to develop this property of being able to remove oneself from the present and the present time and be somewhere else. It's very useful, by the way. I mean, I hope some of you actually got to Paris just then. But if you do get to Paris, you can probably imagine a particular location in Paris. You can possibly even imagine turning around and looking in the other direction, along the Champs-Élysées, for example. So that kind of thing, I think, is intrinsic to the mental organization of animals that move about in the world, and we are animals that move about in the world. So we not only have this capacity to be able to travel mentally in time, but we also have the added capacity to tell others about it and bore people with our last trip to France. Yeah.
The development of speech must be related to the ability to make the sounds that make up language.
Yes.
So is there any fossil evidence of humanoids of when this might have occurred?
Well, I mean, I think other animals can make different sounds, and they have warning cries and alarm calls and the like. I mean, monkeys do this. Monkeys have different alarm calls for different predators, for example, like a snake or a hawk or whatever. And this has been sort of articulated. So they have some ability to change the characteristic of the sound. But as far as we know, it's pretty much built in and inflexible. So we not only have the ability to do it, to make different sounds, but we have the ability to do it intentionally, voluntarily, to create different sounds. And that had to come quite late, I think. But I think the ability to make different sounds is probably present in other primates, and certainly in birds.
What about whales?
Yeah, what about whales? I don't quite know what whales do, but they probably, I don't think they communicated sentences.
They make sounds.
They make sounds, and I think they probably, I mean, I don't know much about whales, to be honest, and maybe somebody else knows more than I do, but it probably has more to do with territory and location and sort of signals rather than sentences, if you know what I mean. So, of course, all animals signal a lot. They signal about things, but nearly all their signaling is about the present, right? What's happening now? You know, I'm being threatened. I'm in a particular, I'm trying to, identify my location or whatever. What I think is special about human language is that it gives us the ability to talk about the non-present. And I think that this is what linguists call displacement, the ability to use language as a displacement, talking about something that's not in front of you. If things are in front of you, you hardly have to have a complicated language. You can kind of squawk and squeak to represent danger and point or whatever. But if you want to talk about things that are not there, you have to have a complicated system, because you have to have particular ways of representing the different things you're talking about and what they do and where they are, right? Like who did what to whom, when, where, and when. It's a complicated system you have to have. But that complexity, I think, doesn't lie in language itself. Language has to deal with that, but it lies in what we think about, like being somewhere else at a different time in a different place.
Can I ask how a user of sign language deals with abstract concepts? For example, how would a user of what I understand is the third official language in New Zealand, New Zealand Sign
Yes.
Language.
Mm.
How do they distinguish between kawanatanga and governance?
I don't know how they do that, but I'm sure they have a different manual symbol or manual movement to represent one as distinct from the other. I mean, they can probably talk about, say, abstract concepts like fear with a particular sign. I don't know enough about sign language to know exactly how they do it, but I'm sure they do it. They have a very neat way of using pronouns, for example, like if you're talking about George and Fred. What you do is you point and you have a symbol for George and you put George there and you put Fred there, right? And then you can point to them when you want to talk about them. Fred hit George. You point to there, that's Fred. You make a hit movement, you point there, that's George. So some of their techniques are different because they can do it in space in front of them. So it's a little bit different trying to do things in space in front of you, which is what sign language does, as distinct from space inside your mouth.
What, if anything, will be the effect of the whole electronic revolution that we're going through at the moment on language?
I think our thumbs will go very long. I don't know. That's a very good question. And
I sometimes think people will lose the power of speech because
yes,
they won't need it.
you might need it, exactly, but I don't think that'll take language away. You know, the language will become on keyboards and things, and it'll probably be just as sophisticated. But language has certainly changed. I mean, I think I've just started to read Jack Reacher, all right? And there's a vast difference between Jack Reacher and Henry James. Because Jack Reacher has sentences that are often 2 or 3 words long. And that to me looks a bit like Twitter. So I think the sort of electronic ways of doing things may alter sentence structure and so forth. Not that there's anything simple about a Jack Reacher story, but I think the sentence structure has changed. And whether that's got to do with a sort of electronic revolution, I don't know. It's almost always impossible to predict the future of these things anyway. One of the rules about evolution is it doesn't tell you anything about the future, but you could guess. Yeah.
I mean, going back to the rats.
Yeah.
Do other species lie?
I think chimpanzees have been shown to lie and play practical jokes, I think. Lying requires voluntary control, right? And one of the things about most animal communication is that it's involuntary, and therefore they can't lie. And so a signal that's given by most animals is an honest signal. So one of the bad things about having a system that's not honest and that's under voluntary control is that you can lie. So I think if you start looking at more voluntary communication among apes, like Kanzi, the one who gestures using a keyboard, I think he has been demonstrated to lie. But I'm not absolutely certain. But it needs a voluntary system is the point, yeah, I think.
But it's, sort of, I mean, it's about as abstract as you can go, isn't it?
Yes, yes. I think that it's usually anecdotal. I think there are a number of anecdotes about chimpanzees playing tricks with these sorts of systems. Yeah, and those systems are themselves intentional or voluntary, unlike their vocalizations. So I don't think there's any evidence of lying through vocalization, but I may be wrong. Yeah.
So not quite lying, but I mean nothing to do with lying actually, but I believe there were some chimpanzees who taught their children to use sign language that they had been taught. And I also thought that Coco, the gorilla, they decided to teach her sign language because she didn't have the right voice box and so on to make sounds, but that she had quite a large vocabulary and could look after a kitten and was very fond of her kitten and so on.
Yes.
So it seems awfully... I don't think it's right to say that we don't know that they can think and so on, because I don't think we can get into their minds.
There are two ways into their minds. One is sort of behavioral. A lot of that is anecdotal, and it's very hard to get control of it. And it looks like lots of things that animals do, as distinct from their vocalizations, seem intentional and possibly even taught. The early attempts were, of course, to try to get chimpanzees to talk. I mean, chimpanzees were raised in human environments, but they never learned to talk. And it's only then that they sort of hit upon the idea of let's try sign language. And that kind of worked. The other thing to say is that chimpanzees and even dogs are capable of quite a large receptive vocabulary. So there's this one famous dog in the US, it's a border collie, that has a vocabulary of over 1,000 words. So you can tell it to go to a room where there's no human, and there's a bunch of objects there, and take a particular object, bring it back and put it in somewhere like a bucket, right? And it can do that. And you can demonstrate through its ability to do that, that its vocabulary, receptive vocabulary, is over 1,000, right? Now it can also do one rather remarkable thing. You can say, go and get the wuggle. It's never heard the word wuggle before. So it'll go into the room and pick out the one object it's never seen before, and from that time on, that object is a wuggle. So that's what's called fast mapping, and children do that pretty effectively too. They'll learn the words. So with respect to understanding language, they're pretty good, and I think that's escaped a lot of people when they're talking about the evolution of language. So the problem is one of production, not one of understanding. Now, I don't think that these dogs could understand a story about something that happened yesterday or whatever, but it's still got a fairly sophisticated ability to discriminate sounds and link them to objects and actions.
Could I ask?
Yeah.
You said there were 6,000 different languages.
Right.
Why didn't we all develop the same language? Why?
Right. There's the biblical story, of course, that God gave a particular language, and there's some debate about what the language was to Adam, and then of course they built the Tower of Babel, and God sort of destroyed it and dispersed them. I think the biblical story is almost right in a sense, that languages mutate, and as people moved around, they developed, the languages shifted. You know, they probably were dialectical and shifted into new languages. So over the course of time, some of these languages then departed completely from where they came from. I think it's partly because language is not simply a means of communicating with other people, it's a means of building a wall around yourself. In other words, language is a kind of fortress. So part of what language does is separate you from other groups. And there must be some evolutionary advantage to that, which may be turning into a disadvantage. So that, I mean, even teenagers start to change the language that their parents taught them. So this happens all the time. It happens, of course, also in academic life. I mean, you may not have understood a word I've said because I've been, hopefully not, using the language of my specialty. So I think people build languages not merely to communicate, but to form groups and in a kind of fortress-like way, taken to the extreme. I mean, languages clearly mutate. As groups moved around, probably small groups moved around, we've gone all over the earth, and as they moved around, they've mutated into incomprehensibility. That's about all I can say about that. I think it's sort of a pity that the universal language didn't persist. The other big question that I don't know the answer to, and I once thought I did, is whether there was once a given language that emerged in Africa with a bunch of people, and then it spread from there and mutated into all the languages that we know. And there have been attempts, of course, to take modern languages and go back to the founding language, like Latin might be the language from which French and Spanish and Italian grew. Or did languages emerge separately in individual groups? And I don't know the answer to that. I once gave a talk in Wellington, and I talked about what's sometimes called proto-world. And proto-world, there are some Russian linguists who claim that they know what proto-world is, and proto-world is the original language, the very first one. And I gave a talk and I mentioned this, and some guy got up and he said, I know proto-world, and he actually sent me by mail the entire vocabulary of the original language. And I sort of said, how do you know this? And he said, I've been watching you people for millions of years. Yes.
There is the myth, of course, about the king who wanted to find out what language a child would speak if nobody spoke to them, and of course, theoretically, well, not theoretically, but what happened was the child died because the desire to have communication was obviously so important. But I'm interested in the very early development of the child in communicating and thinking back to Mae West's idea of body language, and not to underestimate that, because I think we're learning a lot more about those very early patterns, and thinking perhaps too of the reciprocity that's needed, and with the idea of the mirror neurons where imitation is such a powerful way of infant learning. But they've done research showing a mother or somebody very close to the child having a face without any expression and the child becoming increasingly distressed. And I think, I don't know how you feel that we are progressing in terms of understanding a bit more about body language.
Yes, I mean, I think there's quite a good case for supposing that gestural language emerges before vocal language in children. Children point meaningfully before they can use words meaningfully. So I think what happens in you know, child development sort of mirrors what could have happened in evolution, I think. And I think you're right. I think gesture still plays a big role, not only in where we speak and in sign language, but in infancy. Yeah.
Yes. There's a New Zealander working in Glasgow, who is a Professor Emeritus now, Colin Trevathan, who has looked at musicality.
Yes.
And in those early relationships where, like, for example, it's like parentage, like a mother might say, "Oh, you are such a beautiful baby,"
yes.
And the baby learns to respond with the gaps that are exactly in rhythm. And some of the music professors have been amazed that this is now being found to exist at such a very early age.
Yes, Colin's been saying that sort of thing for a long time, and he's probably right. Sometimes people can't see what he sees in what's happening, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
I suppose it's the importance of suprasegmentals.
Can I just correct that story about the children?
Yes, please do.
It was actually James V of Scotland who sent 2 children to an island, and that just off the coast of Edinburgh. And the children didn't die, but they just sort of babbled to each other. And he sent them with a nanny, and nobody was allowed to talk. She was a dumb, she couldn't speak. And interestingly, the children just learnt their own sort of language between them.
Right. Twins, I think, tend to do that. There's also some evidence that children brought up in sign language babble in sign. That is, they make repetitive movements of the hands.
And there are all these people who walk around with their cell phones gesturing.
Yes, yes.
They can't be seen by anybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's said to be that blind people, when they talk on their phones, gesture. I mean, there's nobody to see it. Oh, sorry.
Just returning to the theory about one language permeating the world, which seems hard to believe when you consider somewhere like Papua New Guinea with 300 languages
yes.
they have, and their extreme isolation.
Yes.
Wouldn't there be as much to learn about all of this in a place like a Highland Valley about the evolution of language? Because be they primitive, I mean, it's a difficult word, but wouldn't they represent where a lot of things, wouldn't you see a lot of what went on, where that all started, and study a village like that?
Excuse me, Michael, could you just repeat the question for the people up in that direction?
The question is, some of these like in Australia, did you mention New Guinea, where there are lots and lots of languages that have emerged in isolated people. Wouldn't we learn a lot about the evolution of language by looking at that? In fact, I have a colleague right now who's in Vanuatu, doing precisely that. I think there are over 100 languages in Vanuatu in a fairly confined space. So that's why I was a little bit dubious about the idea of one language having mutated. Maybe both things happen. The other thing that's useful in this respect is looking at the emergence of sign languages. There's a couple of cases, one in Israel, I think, and one in South America, where sign languages have emerged over the last few decades. And one can actually watch how they come about. And again, they do come about through kind of pantomiming, and they conventionalize and develop their own thing. So that's another way to look at how languages actually evolve. And they do so surprisingly quickly, actually. But you're right. I mean, I think by and large, when linguists have looked at the evolution of language, they've looked at English, just English. And Chomsky actually famously said once, you only need one speaker of one language to understand how language emerged. That's nonsense.
Music.
Yeah.
Some sort of international language. Do you mention music in the book?
I don't really. I'm sort of embarrassed by music, I think. I mean, I think it is a form of language, and a lot. Steven Pinker wrote a book about language called The Language Instinct. And he famously said in that book that music is auditory cheesecake. In other words, language is just sort of froth, you know. And of course, people got very offended by that, and now there's a whole mountain of people just looking at music and trying to understand where it came from. And I think it's probably not completely possible to separate it from language. Because, you know, a lot of speech is intonational, prosodic speech, you know, the way the voice goes up and down, may have its origins in music or vice versa. But I don't really know. I mean, it's an embarrassing question. That people sort of come down on one side or the other. You're either a pinker person who think it's auditory cheesecake, or you think it's somehow critical to the evolution of speech itself. And in a way, the gestural theory can be related to it because dance is a kind of pantomime, and dance involves music. So maybe there's a broader story to tell there that incorporates dance as well as pantomime and leads into music. But I haven't been able to tell that story. I'd like to, but I can't. Sorry, I'm being... sorry, I keep with the left wing.
Just like your comment about language and languages and aggression. And I'm leaving it completely open.
Well...
human aggression.
Yes. I mean, there's a sort of... Most animal communication is emotional. And for the most part, I think emotion, like anger, is the enemy of language, because people, when they get angry or frightened, it's hard to cry and talk at the same time. So language tends to fall apart because when things become aggressive and emotional, rather than voluntary, they compete. So I think that's part of it. Of course, you can add intonation to language to make it sound angry or frightened or whatever to some extent. But if fear or anger take over, then you splutter, you know. So I think, in general, I think emotion and language are enemies. But you can modulate language, of course, to introduce an aggressive or fearful element, up to a point. These questions are getting harder. That's okay.
We've listened.
There will be a test.
Will be a test, yeah. I was afraid of. Sorry.
Too hard, are they?
I'm getting that way, but that's okay. That's okay. It's good for me. I learned something.
The second official language in New Zealand is Maori.
Yes.
And behind that is an understanding of the movement of people across the Pacific.
Right.
And leaving behind them different languages.
Yes.
But not entirely different ones.
Right.
And I believe that there is a science called glottochronology,
right,
which tells you when the peoples move,
yes,
by the changes in their language.
Yes.
And that words that are basic, like wai for water and kai for food and so on,
yes,
tend not to change, whereas other more frivolous things,
yes,
do change. Do you have a view on...
I don't have expertise in this, but I have a colleague, Russell Gray, who's in fact done exactly that. He's been able to map out the voyages across the Pacific from South China through the changes in language and figured out from that when things happened and in what order they happened. This is an example, I think, of languages mutating, and the distance they've mutated gives you an idea of how far apart they were in any sequence of migration. Yeah. So that's a very much a field now that's become popular. There was one question back there that I feel...
I think this will be the last one.
Kevin's got one too.
Lady down the back had a question, or gentleman?
Reverting to the primates, is there any indication that they can use adjectives in combination with different nouns? Like, for example, could they say green snake or green panther?
I don't really know. I don't think there's much evidence of that. I mean, they can sort of have words for objects and actions, but I don't know that there's any convincing evidence of adjectives or other forms of speech. But to be honest, I'm not sure. There may, if I looked hard at the literature, I might be able to find something there. It's a good question. They're getting really hard, but there's one here. Yeah.
Yes, we're often told about the language beyond language, the mystic condition, and so I'd like to hear your comments on these possibilities.
Well, I don't sort of believe particularly in the mystic, but I think there are lots of... I think language is actually pretty crude, in the sense that it can't actually attach itself to lots of the things that we feel or think, like intuition, for example. So I think language is actually pretty ineffective in some ways, in terms of what actually goes on in the brain that we would like to communicate. I mean, you're already testing my ability to do that anyway. So I think what we think of as the mystic is often things that we can feel, but we can't actually put in words, is the nearest I can come.
I think that you've been very generous in having your abilities tested, but in saying thank you and goodbye, I'd like to remind you all of what Professor Corballis said a while ago. At some time in the future, in your mind, you have the ability to imagine A, that you're in Devonport, B, that you're here, and 3, that you are here tonight. Thank you very much, everybody.
Not in delivery. Oh dear. It is my pleasant task to thank both our chairman, Max Cryer, and our speaker, Michael Corballis, for an exemplary demonstration of how language can be used. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.